Hello there, I'm Fintusius, and contrary to popular belief, I am in fact still alive, so just like our characters in the Shadowlands. In order to make the best out of that, let me bring you some patch 905 news, which is going to feature the return of the fabled Valor Points as well as Covenant ability tuning alongside some class nerfs and buffs which I'll comment upon, so let's get to it. Let's start by saying that Blizzard posted a message in surprising fashion, as nobody really expected anything, or at least I didn't, before Blizzcon Online, which is still expected to happen in about 10 days from now. They've also said right off the bat that this minor patch is going to release in March and faster than 9.1, as they do not want to keep people waiting for some game improvements they can release faster. While this is a noble statement, all I can think about is BFA and specifically 8.3 tuning, which was left untouched for many months, so hopefully a circus show like that one will not repeat in the future. This also means that you can rule out the possibility of a 9.1 happening in March, but we'll know more about that soon enough. Blizzard in the past stated repeatedly that they want to avoid nerfing anything that is tied to player time investment into systems and their characters, such as for example covenants or legendary items.
Where it's like, oh, if you're a warrior, if you don't pick Venthyr, you're screwing up.
Having said that, they've decided to do some tuning to underperforming Covenant abilities and even legendaries, while slightly nerfing some of the very top performing specs and combos. And this is what they've came up with. Let's start with Fleshcraft, which is the Necrolord signature ability. It has been reworked and comes with a substantial buff in comparison to its current version. It will now give you up to 40% of your max HP over a 3-second channel and still stays for 2 minutes or until broken. Additionally, while channeling, you will now gain a 30% damage reduction. While this looks much better and actually is worth using in situation of need as long as you're a Necrolord, 30% is a massive amount as it's twice as big as Holy Paladin's Devotion Aura through Aura Mastery. While this will not affect 99% of the player base, if numbers were to stay like that, I wouldn't cross out World First Raiders to have a roster full of optimal Necrolord characters for a niche boss in order to pull off some cheese strategy with the whole raid channeling Fleshcraft in order to survive a mechanic, or just to play with one less healer. That could be something, I guess. Oh, and yeah, it now also passively gets its cooldown reduced by 1 second whenever you move near an enemy's corpse. Moving on, Death Knight's Death Stew and Shackled the Unworthy have been slightly buffed, but not enough for you to want to become a fairy Death Knight like you feared during the time of beta that you just might become one, while Shackled the Unworthy is probably the least impactful Covenant ability that they've designed, so hopefully it gets more love in the future. Demon Hunter's Father to the Flame has been reworked, which is now their attempt number 7 at trying to make it work. You now have a chance to spawn a demon while using your abilities that will chase you and attack you, but dies instantly if you throw your glaive at it. When it dies, it deals uncapped AoE damage, however it's stored after 5 targets and heals you for 25% of your max HP. Since this looks pretty random, it will be down to tuning in the future whether or not will people decide to try playing with it, particularly in Mythic Plus. At the same time, since Vengeance Demon Hunters are reigning absolutely supreme in the dungeon kiting meta, which, let's face it, that's what it is, the Fel Defender conduit has been changed to reduce the cooldown of Fel Devastation, while the Kyrian Repeat Decree conduit has had its damage increase nerfed by about 40% across all item levels. My bet is that they're trying to not pigeonhole you into having only one option, as most Demon Hunter tanks are playing that Covenant and Conduit combo. Now after Druids. Adaptive Swarm, which is the Necrolord ability, has had its damage and healing values buffed by about 20% of its base spell power and the damage or healing effects over time to 25%. This was already being played by rested Druids in PvP, so surely the nature-loving folk will enjoy that change so they don't all go Night Fae by default. On top of that, Rejuve for rested Druids has been buffed by 10%, which might lead into some proper value of HPS in raids, thanks to the power of gear scaling through haste and the legendary power Vision of Unending Growth. 9.1 Druid mains, be on the lookout because your time may rise again, as they've fallen short in the raiding meta during Castle Nathria. Additionally, the value of the Venthyr conduit Endless Thirst has been buffed by 30%, so we'll see if that might push some to play with it and try to make it work. For hunters, the Necrolord Death Chakram has received a slight 10% damage buff, which likely is too little for it to become a solid option for those that are after the numbers. On the bright side, however, Flayed Shot has had its damage buffed by about 20%, its start duration increased to 18 seconds, and with a 30-second cooldown, this means that uptime will be at the 60% in a single target encounter. On top of that, the free kill shot proc will now also have a 25% damage increase when used. This is a pretty big buff, but also needed when compared to Night Fae's Wild Spirits, which are ridiculously strong in burst AoE while also being decent in a single target. Now off to mages. Night Fae was the preferred pick for most mages, as a vast majority of them are currently playing fire, as it's ridiculously good for that specialization. In order to compensate that, Blizzard buffed the other 3 covenants, knowing that Venthyr Frost mages were still being played alongside Kyrian. Ventyr's Mirror of Torment ability has been buffed for both Fire and Arcane, as it was already good for Frost as mentioned before. The final mirror damage will now grant you clear casting instead of 4% mana for Arcane, while for Fire it will now reduce Fire Blast cooldown by 6 seconds instead of 4. For Kyrian, Radiant Spark damage and dot have been increased by 10%, and lastly, the Necrolord's Deathborn form has been increased to last 25 seconds instead of 20, and its spell power bonus to 15% instead of 10. Will this be enough to raise some Necrolord mages? We'll see once we have more data, as this should scale nicely in the future with more gear. Now let's get to monks and specifically Mistweavers, as they could really use some love right now in all forms of content. Renewing Mist mana cost has been reduced by 5%, while Vivify saw a reduction of 10%. Now let me ask my dear friend who is a professional whether or not that change will make Mistweaver a bit better.
You know, Finn, ever since I swapped to Paladin, I forgot what meaning the word mana had.
Alright then, thank you Ice. I guess we'll go back to hoping for more Mistweaver changes in the future, which will probably never come, as Blizzard really seemed to hate that class ever since Mist of Pandaria ended. Now off to Paladins, and let's start with Holy. Holy Shock has had its base mana cost increased by about 15%. This means that instead of never going out of mana, you'll now never go out of mana minus 15%. Additionally, Necrolord's Vanquisher Hammer has been buffed by having it generate 1 holy power instead of none, which at least was in line with the amount of paladins playing that covenant. Hopefully it'll get more love in the future, as it's hard to beat Divine Soul, which is good at everything, while most importantly being exceptional at making people go crazy on the forums with clips such as this.
I'm gonna blind.
I'm silent.
Oh, don't DB into it, by the way. I killed him though, but still.
Okay.
Moving on to Priest, Spirit Shell has been nerfed by about 20%, but since Spirit Shell in its design is so powerful, when used properly, nets you close to no overhealing. This will likely remain the most popular way to play Disc Priest in raids. However, having said that lowered value might make it viable to play Evangelism again, when damage patterns in an encounter do not suit playing Spirit Shell optimally if a scenario like that would ever appear. Priest also saw 2 of its legendary powers slightly buffed by reducing Kiss of Death's cooldown by 12 seconds instead of 8, as well as Cauterizing Shadow's value by about 20%. While I'm not certain about Kiss of Death, Cauterizing Shadow's buff might be good enough to see some play in Mythic Plus or Arenas, but that will depend on the final value itself. To top it all off, the Night Fae Covenant ability Fairy Guardians as well as its Conduit have been heavily buffed, making it a very powerful support spell, as it will now increase the cooldown recovery rate of an ally's ability by 150% for 20 seconds, and 80% effective for 4 seconds on other allies if you swap the Fairy around different targets with the Conduit. Its power and usage are undeniably strong, and might see some very powerful but niche play in both dungeons and arena with specs such as Fire Mages or Retribution Paladins, but whether or not Priests will decide to play the role of the team simp will be up to them, as they've already been nagged for power infusion buffs left and right, which honestly isn't an enjoyable experience for anybody. Now let's move on to Rogues. No? What'd you say? What? There's no rogue changes? No? None? Okay then. I'm sorry, I meant Shamans. While there are sadly no reworks, values have been buffed by quite a large amount of all covenants except Venthyr. The Nightfall Transfusion has had its damage buffed by 20% and healing by 40%, but it's actually even more since it scales off the damage it did. While it's clunky to use as enhancement, it might see some play for Restoration Shamans that would like to opt for some more burst damage, which can particularly be useful under the right circumstances. The Kyrian Vesper Totem also received a 20% buff to its damage and healing, but after its heavy nerfs during the beta, it's hard to say if that's going to be enough to make it viable now. To the surprise of everybody, or well, at least me, Primordial Wave for Restoration Shamans has had its healing wave buffed by 50%, making it, well, even better than it already was. Its lightning bolt damage has been increased by 50% for enhancement shamans as well, but since its core design is still pretty terrible, this will likely not make a difference and will remain pretty awful to use as an enhancement shaman until at least you get enough haste to make use of a heavy flame shock spreading build and fire novas. Now to Warlocks. The small good news is that the Venthyr ability Impending Catastrophe has had its dot effects slightly buffed, but it will likely remain too weak to be considered competitive. Hopefully I'm wrong, as it looks really cool and I know a few Warlocks that are not big fans of being Night Fae as a Covenant choice, so they would gladly swap. The bad news is that Malefic Rapture for Affliction has had its base spell damage nerfed by about 20%, as it was starting to scale out of hand already. This minor nerf is only to keep Affliction from potentially becoming too strong. And lastly, we have Warriors. After receiving a few buffs already in the Shadowlands, Fury Warriors have started to rise up in any scenario that offers some cleave damage potential, such as dungeons, which leads me to believe that Blizzard did the proper tuning pass, as Warriors tend to scale better with gear than other classes or specs, so they want to be careful in order to not overbuff it, as nobody likes allies getting nerfed afterwards. Today, however, we're not going to talk buffs but rework, as Warriors received the reworked Necrolord ability known as Conqueror's Banner, which is an ability that had quite a few design issues in the past, going from bad to great to bad again. Since most of you probably never saw the current version of the ability in game, let's treat it as a new one. Conqueror's Banner is an ability on a 2-minute cooldown which places a banner on the ground which will buff you and 2 nearest allies near that banner by granting them 400 mastery and preventing them from having their movement speed reduced below 100%. Over the duration, it also generates 4 rage per second for yourself for a grand total of 60 rage. This means that if you decide to play with that banner in a group, some people might somewhat fight others and try to be closer to the banner so they can get their mastery buff instead of some other person. While this can technically lead into some small toxic gameplay, overall, if you were to spec into it, 400 mastery on top of a conduit that increases your strength by about 15% makes it numerically very powerful, but most importantly, it's an enormous buff for any spec that benefits greatly from a huge mastery buff such as Fire Mages, Boomkins or Retribution Paladins. The added movement speed effect can make it especially useful in PvP, which would make warriors have arguably no bad covenant choices. Another side effect of that is that protection warriors, which could very much use some love right now, might become viable in the eyes of others as they would become potentially the highest dealing tank specializations because of that banner buffing your allies alongside yourself. Take everything I said with a grain of salt because as usual, all is down to tuning, but to sum it up, this looks very playable compared to its previous version. To finish off the video, let's have a look at what everyone was hoping for. We've asked for it for years and they have finally listened. Well, sort of, but it's still great anyway. Valor Points are indeed making a comeback and will work similarly to how Conquest in PvP works alongside upgrading PvP items. To sum it up, you gain Valor Points from doing Covenant callings or completing Keystone dungeons. Those points come with a weekly cap. While unconfirmed, it should have a catch-up similar to Conquest, meaning that you don't have to cap it every week, as you'll be able to catch it up whenever you feel like it. Once you obtain any mythic dungeon item, you will be able to upgrade it all the way up to 220 item level. Upgrading gear comes in 4 stages and is locked behind 3 separate mythic plus achievements. Any dungeon item you obtain can be increased up to 200 item level without any achievement restriction, which is similar to how unranked item level works in PvP. Completing all mythic plus 5 dungeons in time will allow you to upgrade your items to 207, while you'll need all plus 10 timed for 213 and all plus 15 timed for 220 respectively. Having said that, for those that remember the old Valor Point system, as of right now, this will only serve as a way of upgrading gear you've already acquired from dungeons, as you will not be able to go to a vendor and just buy that specific item level piece first. Time will tell if that gets changed at some point or not. I'll make sure to pin a comment and update the information, so be on the lookout for that. This should cover everything we know about patch 9.05 and looking ahead into 9.1, and we'll 100% get more information during Blizzcon Online as mentioned before. By the way, I'm now streaming on Twitch usually on Monday, Wednesday and Friday between 4 and 7 PM of Central European time. I usually try to help people get raiding in arenas while trying to coach them on the EU Horde. If that may be of interest to you, feel free to stop by and come hang out and play together in the future maybe. If you enjoyed the video, you can drop a like and tell me in the comments what kind of topic would you like me to cover next. Goodbye.